This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Haidul Hashem kitayv ki li'olam chastai. B'leiv malei simcha, our hearts are overflowing with joy and gratitude to the Rabbi Shalom for giving us such a matana taiva, for giving us a new son, and that we have the schus to be machnis our son, Bris shel Avram Avinu. We thank all of our family and friends who have come from far and wide to join in our simcha. We're very grateful to our Rosh Yeshiva Shlita, Rav Harish Shlita, Rav Grumblat Shlita, who took the time out of their busy schedules to grace us with their presence. We thank Rav Moshe Tovia Leaf Shlita, our family's Rav, who came all the way from Flatbush to join in the family simcha because he's part of our family. It's a special simcha to be able to enjoy together with my parents, my grandparents, my in-laws, and all of our family and friends who have come to join us. This has been my first opportunity to make a bris here together with this wonderful kehila. Shulchan Aruch tells us in Yardei in Siman Shin Tzadid Aleph, "V'kivon shenoilad ben zachar nisrapa kol hamishpacha." That when a baby boy is born, the whole family is cured, the whole family is healed. So it's our tefillah that the baby boy, the Rachanimo, should bring bracha, Yeshuas v'nachamas, refuahs to the whole mishpacha and to the entire kehila who is part of our extended family. Ad bias goyel tzedek. Amen. Many of the mitzvahs in the Torah are performed rather unceremoniously, without too much fanfare, without making a suda. Mitzvah of shofar, dalin minim, mezuzah. You do the ma'aseh mitzvah, you perform the act is done, and you're finished. And yet when it comes to the mitzvah of Bris Milah is different. The custom is, the minhag is, in B'chol Tfutzos Yisrael, after the mitzvah of Bris Milah, we make a sudas mitzvah. Says Rabbeinu B'chaye in the Kad HaKemach about this minhag, says Rabbeinu B'chaye, u'minhag kosherhu. Rabbeinu B'chaye approves of this custom. Says Rabbeinu B'chaye, ki ru'uya sheyisasvu hakroivim v'ha'ayavim l'smayach v'la'asoi suda mitzvah hazois. Says Rabbeinu B'chaye, it is appropriate, it is fitting to make a suda regarding this mitzvah. What's the reason for this minhag? What's the reason for the custom of making a suda by Bris Milah? We don't make a suda by every mitzvah, says Rabbeinu B'chaye. It's a pasuk in Tehillim. In Tehillim, Perek Nun, David HaMelech declares upon the occasion of Bris Milah, perhaps even the Bris Milah of Shlomo HaMelech. Says David HaMelech, Isfu li chasidai, gather to me my chasidim. Karsei brise. For what occasion? Says David, gather people for Bris Milah. Why should you gather people for Bris Milah? Alei zavach. Because Bris Milah is a carbon. Because Bris Milah, in some sense, in some form, in some dimension, Bris Milah has the status of a carbon. And just like a carbon is a suda, you partake of the carbon, you eat of the carbon is like a suda, so too says Rabbeinu B'chaye, Alei zavach. A Bris Milah is a carbon. And since it's a carbon, you have to make a suda. And in fact, Rabbeinu B'chaye cites the Medrash. The Medrash tells us that just like a carbon is only fit to be brought after the 7th day, on the 8th day, U'miyayim hashmini v'hala yeratzeh. That is why, says the Medrash, Milah is on the 8th day. Because in some dimension, a Bris Milah is like a carbon to Hashem. Now this was very interesting to me, that this concept that Bris Milah is like a carbon is not just some type of abstract idea, not just some conceptual idea, but there are literally dozens and dozens of nafkaminas, halachic ramifications, l'maisa. I'll share a few examples with you. The Ramah writes in Siman Reis Samachay and Sif Yud Aleph, what do you do if you have a conflict? You have one aliyah to give out, you don't know who to give it to. Should you give the aliyah to the mayal, or should you give the aliyah to the sandak? Who do you give the aliyah to? Says the Ramah, v'yafeh koyach ha-sandak mikoyach ha-mayal. The sandak takes precedence over the mayal. Why? Why does the sandak take precedence over the mayal? After all, the sandak is only a misayeya. He's only assisting the mayal. The mayal is the one who's performing the entire act. So says the Chassam Sofer in the Tshuva, that in fact, the sandak is performing two roles. Since Milah is like a carbon, since a Bris Milah is a virtual sacrifice, so in effect, the sandak becomes like the Mizbeach. The knees of the sandak attain the status of the altar, of the Mizbeach, so we could look at the Sandak in two dimensions. Number one, the Sandak is like the Mizbeach, and number two, the Sandak is assisting the act of the Milah. On the other hand, says Chassam Sofer, the Moyel is only performing the act. And therefore, says Chassam Sofer, since the Moyel only has one Milah, and the Sandak has two Milas, from here, the Ramah derives Yafeh Kayach HaSandak Mikayach HaMoyel. Another example. You look at the Mechaber in Siman Reish Samachay and Siftes. Says the Mechaber, Avi Haben Oimer Al HaMoyel Lo Hitziyai Shehu Shluchai. The father, halachically, is required to be standing next to the Moyel at the time of the Milah. Now obviously every father is going to be standing there. What father is not going to be standing, presiding over the Milah? But nevertheless, the halacha requires that the father be standing there the whole time. So as the Vilna Gaon and the Bir Hagra, once the father made the Moyel the Shliach, so the father's finished with. The father appointed the Shliach. The father doesn't have to stick around. Why does the halacha require that the father stand over the baby, stand next to the Moyel at the time of the Milah? Says the Bir Hagra, that a Milah is like a carbon. And the Gemara in Tainis Daf Chavav says about a carbon that the Bailim must be standing over the carbon throughout the procedure. The Gemara says, Efshur shehei karbanoi shaladam karev, v'hu einoi oimid agavav. So since, the Gemara says, since there's a requirement that the father stand there because Milah is like a carbon, that is the explanation for the halacha of the Shulchan Aruch. One last nafkamina I would like to mention. Rabbi Kiva Eger points out, Sif Aleph, that at the time of the brachos, when the brachos are made, after the actual Milah takes place, says Rabbi Kiva Eger, look in the Sefer Torah Chaim HaMasechta Chulin, where it says, who should be holding the baby during the brachos? Only the Sandak, not to give it to anybody else. Says the Torah Chaim, quoted by Rabbi Kiva Eger, who should drink the wine of the Bar Pri Hagafen? Make sure the Sandak drinks the wine. Rabbi Kiva Eger does not explain why. So if you look up the Torah Chaim explains that since Milah is like a carbon, and then the Sandak attains the status of the virtual Mizbeach, and every carbon has to have Nisuch HaYayin, so where are you going to pour the wine from the Milah? Where are you going to pour the Nisuch HaYayin? So therefore, says the Torah Chaim, one of the Kadmonim, make sure the Sandak drinks the wine of the Milah, so this way you're fulfilling the aspect of carbon of Nisuch HaYayin. Yaakov Emden writes the same thing in the Migdal. So what we're seeing is that there are literally halachic ramifications, or nafkaminos lahalacha, about this concept that bris milah is like a carbon. So I was thinking about it. What does this mean that a bris milah is like a carbon? What's the father supposed to be thinking as he's presenting the moyo with the kid? That he's offering his child as a sacrifice? What type of carbon is this? Carbon chatas? Carbon asham? Well, the father all of a sudden has many averos at the time of the milah that he has to bring a carbon. Is it a carbon oila? What exactly is the meaning of this concept that a milah is a carbon? And in general, the Rishonim grapple, what is a carbon? What's the purpose of a carbon? What's the function of a carbon? The Rambam, we know, says karbanos is to distance someone from avodah zarah. By bringing a carbon to Hashem, it keeps a person away from serving avodah zarah. Is that what the father is supposed to be thinking when he offers his son to the Mayal? That he's keeping away from avodah zarah? The Ramban says the reason, the meaning of karbanos is that it's ma'or a person to do tshuva. A person should think that he's the one who should be sacrificed. He's the one who should be slaughtered. Is that the aspect of carbon that applies to the carbon of bris milah? There is, however, a third explanation of karbanos that is brought down by the Akedas Yitzchak that perhaps is very relevant to the concept that bris milah is like a carbon. The Akedas Yitzchak writes in Shar Memches that human nature is that when someone bestows upon a person tremendous chesed, it gives a person simcha, it gives a person satisfaction, if they could at least feel that they're giving back a little bit to their benefactor. It gives a person oineg, even if they're not really giving back. But if a person is just taking from a benefactor without the ability to give back, he cannot enjoy what he's getting. Says the Akedas Yitzchak, if this is so by a human benefactor, all the more so when it comes to the Ribono Shel Olam. The Ribono Shel Olam constantly showers us with everything we have, with our lives, with our livelihood, with our families, with everything, with our homes, myriads and myriads of blessings. And inside a person has a deep-seated desire to be able to give back a little bit to the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore, says the Akedas Yitzchak, Ribono Shel Olam gave Klal Yisrael a Mishkan. He gave Klal Yisrael a Beis HaMikdash. For what purpose? L'sameach nefesh Yisrael. To give us happiness, to give us joy, so that Klal Yisrael could feel at least they're giving back a little bit to the Ribono Shel Olam. Perhaps then we could suggest that this is the aspect of carbon that applies to a Bris Milah. Can there be any greater bracha in the world than to have a healthy child? A healthy baby boy. The bracha is so immense. Remember, we used to go to hear Rabbi Victor Miller Zechat Tzak Livracha, and he used to say over that if a baby boy is born healthy, the doctors would tell him it's an open miracle. For a baby to be born healthy, billions and billions and billions of phenomena have to be working correctly. So the chesed of the Ribono Shel Olam, to have a healthy baby boy, certainly it's unfathomable. It's mind-boggling. A person cannot begin to understand it. Certainly there's nothing a person could have done to deserve such a chesed. I always think in next week's Parsha, Parshas Vayishlach, when Esav approaches Yaakov Avinu, and Esav says, who are these kids? Who are these children? So I was always taken by the language that Yaakov Avinu uses. Yaakov says, Hayoladim asher chanani Elokim esavdecha. These are the children, not asher nasanli, asher chanani. It's a matnas chinam. It's a freebie. It's a gift for nothing. Even Yaakov Avinu, with all of his gadlus, with all of his tzidkos, Bechir Shabbat recognized that children, such a tremendous bracha from the Ribono Shel Olam, asher chanani. It's a matnas chinam. And therefore when a person has a child, they're overcome with emotion. Ma'ashiv l'Hashem kol tagmulai alai. How can I ever repay the Ribono Shel Olam for everything He's given me? So the Ribono Shel Olam, in His infinite love, l'sameach nefesh Yisrael, He gave Klal Yisrael Bris Milah, which is a carbon, so that we could have the oineg, we could have the simcha perhaps, and the satisfaction, that we could feel at least, that somehow we're repaying the Ribono Shel Olam just a little bit. In other words, what we're suggesting is that the carbon of Bris Milah is a carbon taida. It's a carbon of thanksgiving. And perhaps this would explain why David HaMelech says, Isfu li chasidai, gather for me. When you bring a carbon, even if people eat from the carbon, you are not proactive to include people to come eat from your carbon. The only carbon that you're proactive to gather people is the carbon taida. Like the Netziv explains, in order to be able to praise Hashem barabim. And perhaps we could bring a raya to this pshat, that the carbon of Bris Milah is a carbon taida. Because immediately after David HaMelech says, Isfu li chasidai, karsei brisi alei zavach. David HaMelech says, you want to know what kind of zavach we're talking about? David HaMelech says in the upcoming psukim, Zoiveach le'lokim taida. We offer to Hashem a carbon taida. And he concludes chapter Nun, Zoiveach taida yichabedanani. It's a great kavod to name our son Shlomo Zalman, to my great-grandfather, my mother's mother's father, Zechat Tzak Livracha, who I remember very, very clearly, very vividly. I had the zchus to spend time with Zaidi Zalman, and when I was 10 years old, we went to Eretz Yisrael, we visited with him. Zaidi Zalman was a legendary person, really a legendary person. He's a tremendous Baal Chesed. He was the founder of the Tzedakah, Keren Yad L'Chaim. And when he came to America in the early 1900s, he was Moiser Nefesh Mamish to keep Shabbos. Every week he would come into the job, the boss would say, you don't come in Saturday, don't bother coming in Monday. And week after week after week, he would lose his job, until finally he was able to convince one of the bosses that he could produce more in 6 days than everybody else produced in 7 days. But perhaps what stands out most in my mind about Zaidi was the revolution that he created in Flatbush when he moved there. Zaidi Zalman was very much self-educated. He taught himself to learn. He taught himself to read Shulchan Aruch, to read Mishnah Berurah. And one day he gets up to Siman Kuf Chaf Dalet in the Mishnah Berurah. And the Shulchan Aruch writes, the Imsach, that someone who talks by Chazaras Hashatz, who chayte, he's a sinner. V'godel avoinoi minasai. V'goyerim by. The Shulchan Aruch says, you scream at the guy. So Zaidi Zalman, he's reading the halacha, doesn't know any chachmas, that's the halacha, that's what it says, it's a brick wall, that's what you have to do. And he was mekayim the halacha b'miluai. After davening, he was your best friend. But you better not say a word anywhere near him during davening. And he really created a revolution in Flatbush, one of the well-known, established shuls in Flatbush today. Where they have a Rav who's renowned all over as a tremendous paisek, credits. That shul is known of all the shuls in Flatbush to be very medaktek about talking. And I heard the Rav say that he credits Zaidi Zalman for this establishment, for this institution. So when I was given the privilege to join this shul, one of our goals, although we didn't realize it yet, one of our goals was to create an environment of kavod tefillah, of heightening the sensitivity to kedushas tefillah, where talking by davening was not an option. And there's no question, it was a formidable task, it was a formidable challenge, but what gave me the confidence to be able to try to tackle this challenge was the model of Zaidi Zalman. Because to me, it wasn't a halacha, it was in my blood, it was in my DNA. There's no talking by davening. It's understood. Remember when I started the job over here, a visitor once called me after Shabbos. He says, Rabbi, b'mechilas kavoidcha. And when you hear that, b'mechilas kavoidcha, Rabbi, you're a kid. What do you think you're doing? You're establishing a no-talking policy? And he said with all seriousness, don't you know, Rabbi, my minhag is to talk. My father talked. So I remember I told him, in this shul we're starting a new minhag. We don't talk, so our children won't talk. And there's no question that this was not something I cholamed on my own. There's not something I came up with on my own. This was the Messiah that our family has from our Zaidi. And Baruch Hashem, today it's a very great source of pride. And I'm not exaggerating, and I say this with all honesty. Everybody knows when they come into the shul, there is no talking by davening. Not, there's a little bit, not that it's pretty good. And everybody, I stand behind that. There is no talking by davening in the shul. And really the credit goes to the kehillah. The credit goes to this wonderful kehillah who was receptive to this message, who wanted to take on and tackle this problem. And they were makabel, this hanhaga toiva, bi'ava uveratzain, basically. So to name our son, Shlomo Zalman, after our Zayda, in a makom where his influence is felt so strongly, in a place where his influence produced peiros harbe, it's a tremendous kavod for our family. It should be an aliyah for his neshama. Every tefillah that takes place in the shul should be an aliyah to his neshama. Ad bias goyel tzedek. Amen. Just to conclude with one bracha. The bracha that the Rebbeinu Shalom gave Shlomo HaMelech v'chacham mikol adam. The Rebbeinu Shalom says to Shlomo, Sha'al v'mayatem lach. Ask me, I'll give you whatever you want. And Shlomo HaMelech says, please Rebbeinu Shalom, v'nosata le'avdecha leiv shomeya. I don't want wealth, I don't want success, I don't want long life, I want chachma, I want the heart of understanding. Says Rebbeinu Shalom, Shlomo b'ni, you didn't ask for wealth, you didn't ask for arichas yamim. Not only will I give you chachma, I will give you everything. I will give you chachma, I will give you ashiros, I will give you hatzlacha, I will give you arichas yamim. So on behalf of my wife, our bracha to our son Shlomo Bani, Shlomo Zalman, your quest in life, Yihi Cheshkoi B'Torah, your quest in life should be for a heart of understanding, and thereby the Rebbeinu Shalom should bless you b'chol bracha sheba'olam, should be zaycha legadloi, leTorah, lechuppah, le'lamasim tovim. Mazel tov. Thank you everyone for coming.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.